Hey everybody, it's Rabbit. Welcome back to the channel, and today we're going to be doing the second part in our CAS series, where I explain to you how a lot of the precision-guided weapons work, and also going through some of the various pieces of equipment that you'll have available at the higher echelons of the game. Now, because there is a lot more tech involved in these weapons, we're going to be going through a few more keybinds, or stuff that you'll have to need to have a keybind for in order to use these weapons, or to at least make sure you know what the key is bound to. But other than that, it should be a basic overview of the mechanics, how the weapons work, strengths, weaknesses, and how best to employ them. Now, one small note before we get started with this video, and it could have also applied to last video, but it's more relevant this time around. There's a setting if you go to the options and the air battle settings called Empty Weapon Containers Automatic Jettison. What this does is once you've expended a rocket pod or a bomb rack, it will automatically drop them off of the plane. You should always enable this as on, it's off by default, because ultimately if you don't have this on, you're just keeping all these spare bomb and rocket racks on your plane that are empty, and that just adds weight and drag, and it doesn't help you out at all. So there's really no reason to not enable this feature. And to kick us off for this video, we're going to go with the CCIP, or Constantly Calculated Impact Point. These are used for giving you precision guidance for guns, rockets, and bombs, even though those weapons are typically unguided. Now, how this will work, and you know a plane has a CCIP if you go into the X-ray and you mouse over the pilot, it'll tell you if it has gun, rocket, or bomb CCIP. When you go into the game, even in ground realistic, you will now get aiming points for rockets or bombs like you get with arcade mode. On top of that, you don't natively get a CCIP for guns, but you can turn it on or off in the menu or by using a keybind. The reason you don't have the gun ballistic computer on by default is because if you were trying to engage another plane, obviously those aren't on the ground, so your aim point would just be bouncing all over the place. So you have to specifically turn on a gun CCIP if your plane has it, but it won't be on by default. The ballistic computer can give a lot of extra life into basic unguided bombs and rockets, and even guns to a lesser extent, by allowing you to artificially extend their range and hit targets much further out, much more accurately. The CCIP isn't 100% accurate, but it is close enough for government work, and you can reliably land hits from pretty far away, upwards of 4 to 5 kilometers, depending on how good you are. It even makes it a lot easier to do toss bombing strategies where you basically pull up and use the CCIP's location to launch bombs at a target instead of just dropping them vertically. So that can be pretty interesting, although again it is kind of hard to land. But when we go into laser guided bombs and even some of the optically guided bombs, that kind of toss bombing becomes a lot more viable, but at least for the dumb bombs, it is at least a lot easier to do with a CCIP. Next up, we have the CCRP, or Constantly Calculated Release Point. Now, in order to use this, you're going to have a button mapped to lock a target point on the ground. However, you kind of want that anyway, even though the CCRP isn't that useful, because several of the other systems we'll be using later, you kind of want to be able to do that. But essentially what this does is you lock a target point on the ground, and then you fly in relatively straight and level over it, and it will tell you when you release your bombs. And it's not as super useful for ground battles, as you can probably figure out, because your target has to be stationary for a very long period of time. So much like with the heavy bomber sight we talked about in the last episode, it's really only useful for going off after the enemy spawn or capture points, and even then you have to fly in a relatively straight line to hit it, so it is a lot worse than just having like a CCIP or any form of guided weapon. It's a very limited use in ground battles. The first category we're going to be looking into is M-close missiles. These are manual command line of sight. If you look on the missile stat card and you look at the guidance type, it will say M-close, and that tells you that this is the type of guidance it's using. The most common M-close missiles in the game are the American bullpups, although the Soviet KH-23s are also M-close missiles, and they also basically use the same guidance system. In order to use an M-close missile, you will have to have some sort of control set up for the X and Y axis and know how to use them. And essentially what you do, because this is manually piloted, you're going to have to basically fly these like you would a radio-operated airplane. And this is one of the more difficult aspects of M-close missiles. Because you're trying to fly them in 3D space, depth perception on how far away the missile is away from you and how close it is to the target is kind of awkward. My best advice with the M-close missiles, because I'm not necessarily the best person with them, but to try to give you my advice for how I manage to hit targets with it, is You want to do basically the same thing you do with M-close missiles in ground battles. That is to say, you point your vehicle as close as possible to the point you want to aim. That way the corrections you have to make are relatively small. Now, in theory, you could just fly in straight level flight and fire it and pilot it like 90 degrees off of the aircraft. The problem is this is, again, incredibly difficult. There's a big issue with depth perception that just makes this very problematic, and I have not really gotten the hang of trying to fly these at really sharp angles. So I mostly just point the plane in the general direction of the target and fire it. The big advantage of these kind of M-close missiles is that you can accurately hit targets much further away than you can with rockets, even with something like a CCIP, and they are reasonably powerful. So they do provide you with pretty good punch, and especially if you get them on some of the lower BR planes like the American A4E, you can take out anti-air from so far away. A lot of the anti-air can't really shoot back effectively. The next category of weapons we're going to be looking at are TV-guided weapons or television-guided weapons. These types of weapons use an optical seeker to locate and track the target. Now, in order to lock onto the target, the easiest way to do this is going to be to use the lock target point button that we talked about with the CCRP, lock onto something vaguely near the battlefield, and then zoom in to the missile site. And then once you're in that missile site, it will be relatively stable and about where you locked on, and you can try to look around and find the target. Alternatively, you can try to lock on just by pressing the release bomb or missile button, whether it's a bomb or missile depending on the type, and this will automatically create a small white targeting box that you can try to center on the target, although this is pretty imprecise and doesn't always track correctly. You can tell that a TV-guided weapon is locked on correctly if it starts moving with the target, or if you aim it near the target and it snaps to the target. That means that the TV-guided weapon has found the thing that you are trying to get it to find. It is important to note with TV-guided weapons that they're looking for contrast optically. So if you have really bad weather, like you have a lot of cloud cover or fog, TV-guided weapons, unless they have some kind of additional IR component like some of like the AGM-65D does, are not going to be able to find targets at all. They're basically useless in bad weather, which is they're the only weapon currently that cannot function in bad weather. So it is important to keep that on the back of your mind, because you might want to have backup loadouts for things that you have basically TV-guided weapons for, just in case you have a map that you can't really use them on. In general, though, the big advantage of TV-guided weapons like the American Maverick or the American AGM-62s, or there are even some Russian-guided weapons if you go further up the tech tree, is that once you fire them, they're done. You don't have to worry about them anymore. They will track the target and hit the target on their own. You can take evasive action, you can set up for another attack run, etc., etc., etc. So while they are very useful weapons, they also do have that strong limitation of they only work in certain weather environments, and even then that's only if you can get the seeker to cooperate. For the next categories of weapons, we're going to be looking at laser-targeted missiles and laser-targeted bombs. So there are two things that you need to either make sure you have buttons mapped for, or alternatively, you need to make sure you know how to access it in the multifunction menu. The first one is turn on or off night vision. This is mostly just useful for thermal imaging for the planes that have it. Not every plane that has laser-guided weapons has thermal imaging, but a lot of them do currently, especially with the targeting pods. And this will allow you to essentially pick up and see targets a lot easier. Incidentally, targets and thermals tend to render from further away, so you kind of avoid the render distance problem that you can get from like trying to use just the Mark 1 eyeball, essentially just visually spotting targets. The other thing you're going to need is an auto tracker. Again, not everything with laser guided missiles or bombs has an auto tracker, but several of them do. This is a feature where it will essentially lock onto them. It's basically an optically guided system. It's locking onto the image of the target, and it will follow them no matter where they go, and this can allow very easy hits on moving targets. However, the auto tracker has a harsh limitation in that if you get multiple targets together, like destroyed vehicles, friendly vehicles, enemy vehicles, whatever, it starts to spaz out and go between them, and it will also lose targets if they go through smoke, foliage. Obviously it will lose them to go through buildings, etc. But it is a handy feature, especially for targets that are mostly on their own on parts of the battlefield in relatively open terrain, because you can reliably hit them with the auto tracker. And as one final note, the sight stabilization button ironically does not stabilize the sights. What you actually have to do if you want to keep your sights from wobbling all to hell is you have to use the lock target point button that we talked about with CCRP. That way it will stabilize the sights on that area, and then you can go into the weapon view and it will be perfectly stable. It will stay exactly where you're pointing it. So you should definitely do that before you start targeting any of the laser guided weapons. Now, despite the fact that laser-guided missiles and bombs use very similar systems for acquiring their targets, they are actually pretty different in terms of how they're used. So first we'll go with the laser-guided missiles. These are predominantly used by Russian aircraft, and what they do is you have this big green targeting box. The target has to be within that box, and then you also have to acquire the target, turn on the laser, and fire the missile. Now, usually the laser will turn on just by hitting the missile fire button, so as long as you have a button mapped to fire guided missiles, that will work, or ground-based guided missiles, that will just turn the laser on automatically. But the laser does have to be on, the target has to be in the box, and if you don't meet both those criteria, the missile doesn't fire. Additionally, the target has to stay in that box for basically the whole flight time, or the missile will lose guidance and go stupid. It might still hit if it was most of the way there, but if you do it really early, it'll probably miss. This does create some pretty harsh limitations in that you have to fly pretty close towards the target, and in practice, these laser-guided missiles don't end up being dramatically better than something like, say, a bullpup, especially if you're using them on like the Su-25s where they don't have a lot of optical zoom in their sights, so you are kind of trying to spot very small targets from a very long distance away, but they still are pretty useful and they're fairly powerful. Next up are the laser-guided bombs. Now, laser-guided bombs are a little more unique because they don't have a specific targeting parameter. As long as you can laser it, the bomb will go towards it. However, the bomb can only fly so far. So this is where you have to use the targeting circle on the ground from your CCIP to try and get that close enough to the target so that when you drop, the bomb will be able to kind of guide and correct from there. Additionally, one thing that's very important to note, it also applies to optically guided bombs, so you want to keep that in mind as well, is you really want a 0-second fuse on laser guided bombs because it makes it significantly easier to hit moving targets. Especially because you're dropping laser guided bombs generally from such high altitude that you're never going to get caught in it. The same thing kind of goes for the optically guided bombs, so I would definitely change my fuse timer if you were using these weapons pretty regularly. The only other thing you really need to remember about lasers is you need to keep the pod that is on the aircraft, usually it's on the underside of the aircraft, pointing towards the target. So if you do a lot of like rolling or other defensive maneuvers, you can definitely lose lock with these laser guided weapons. Overall, the advantage of laser-guided missiles and bombs is that they can be incredibly precise for hitting targets. However, they do require your aircraft to basically stay on target the entire time, unlike some of the optically guided weapons. But they do also generally have better range and are easier to target than something like, say, the M-close guided missiles that we talked about earlier. And to close this out, we're going to talk about some of the more unusual weapon systems, just give them a brief note, even though most of them are either situational or not very useful. First off is napalm. Napalm can only take out open-top vehicles, that's literally it. It does very little, if any, damage to other vehicles, so it's only useful really in air realistic where you can use it to bomb bases. Then you have the dirt bombs, which are the bombs with the drag chutes or the drag fins. This will slow their descent. You can kind of use them at high speeds and low altitudes to try and hit targets with. They're pretty useful in that respect, but they're not the best and it's difficult to truly be accurate with them. Lastly, you have, and this is the only weapon of its type in the game, the Tornado IDS has an anti-ship missile system. This is a fire and forget missile where you can lock onto and hit ships. Currently in game, this system is only able to lock onto ships. You used to be able to lock onto planes for a little bit, but they kind of removed that. It's kind of a useless feature because there are no ships at the battle rating where the IDS is. I'm not even sure if you could take it into sim battles. Maybe it's useful for that, but in realistic battles it's basically useless. But it is an interesting weapon. All you really have to do is lock the ship and then you hit the missile button, and that will give you a nice little targeting box. Once it's acquired, you can just launch it and it will track and hit the ship. So it's an interesting feature, but currently is basically useless in game, so that's good to know. If I had to pick a favorite aircraft around these battle ratings where you have all these smart weapons, it would probably be the A7D Corsair. The A7D Corsair can carry up to 6 Mavericks and up to 2 AGM-62 Walleyes, so you have a nice inventory of weapons to hit everything. Additionally, something I didn't really talk about in the rest of the video, but when you're in the optical guidance mode, if you have multiple weapons that have optical guidance, like for example the GBU-8s and the AGM-65s, you can lock on optically with basically both of them at the same time and just pick which one you want to launch, which is kind of cool. But the Corsair just having 8 optically launched fire and forget weapons, on top of the fact that it's not completely useless in a dogfight, it turns reasonably well, it has a pretty good 20mm gun, it just isn't that fast, and it also has 2 sidewinders. I really like the A7D Corsair, it's probably one of my favorites. And that concludes our video on CAS. This is the second part of the series. There will be another part of the series coming up next that is focusing on helicopters. So make sure to hit the subscribe button if you want to get notices when that releases. I hope you enjoyed the video. Hope you found it fun. Hope you found it entertaining. Have a nice day, everybody.